Remember, our mics are hot now. Yeah, these y'all don't know, these seats are really soft. I must say.
They really are.
This is lovely. So hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming to the panel today. Today, my name is Lecolion Washington. I'm the executive director of the Community Music Center of Boston. And I also roll deep, as you can see, with my staff. Thank you, everybody. And maybe we can just go down and just introduce our names and the organizations that we're with before I go into some framing slides.
I am Glenda Price, a member of the board of directors of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra and involved in Sphinx for many years during the years that I was president of Marygrove College here in Detroit.
And I'm Becca Smith. I'm an executive recruiter with H.C. Smith Limited. I've been recruiting for a very long time. Prior to that, I was with the Cleveland Orchestra and with Columbia College in Chicago.
I'm Weston Sprott, Dean and Director of the Preparatory Division at the Juilliard School and a trombonist in the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra.
So the conversation that we're going to be having today is, of course, ending in musical chairs, how to bring about systemic change through organizational hiring practices. When we were thinking about this particular session, really the conversation was understanding how organizations can really become more equitable in their hiring practices, creating pathways, particularly for young administrators of color to be able to not move into, but move up within arts organizations. I'm going to share a couple of framing slides with you before we get into our conversation. That's our title there. Let's see what happens if it moves. Can I get someone in tech to move to the next slide? Thank you. So I'm going to show this here. Raise your hand if you've ever seen the Johari window before. Okay, more people have seen it, but still not everyone. The Johari window, it's a nice framing. The four people here, we all have various perspectives in the hiring process, and the Johari window is a really cool way of thinking about the concept of perspective. So, and it sounds like it's a really cool Johari window, but there's a guy named Joe and a guy named Harry who came up with a window. And it is then Johari window. Across the top, on the kind of x-axis, you see things that are known to self and not known to self. And going down vertically on the y, you have things that are known to others and not known to others. And it creates these four quadrants. The upper left quadrant is what's called the arena. There are things that, for example, things you know about me and things that I know about me. You all know that I'm the executive director of the Community Music Center Boston because I announced that. I am also a bassoonist. I had a long career as a bassoonist. Now you know that, and I move those things into the arena. Below that, there are things that I know about me that you don't know about me. So for example, something you may not know about me is that I have two sons. Right, so I may walk in the world as a person who has no kids, but then you now found out that I do have children, and so now I've moved part of my facade into the arena. So there's more about me that you know now, and institutionally and in these processes, you want to try to have as many things in the arena as possible. And then on the upper right, you see not known to self and not known to self and known to others. In that space, there are things, so for example, if I had spinach in my teeth, I would not know that I had the spinach in my teeth, but that would be something that you would know about me that I didn't know about myself. And that's a blind spot. And we'll talk a lot about organizational and institutional blind spots and individual blind spots as well. And then the last things not known to self and things not known to others, that's the unknown. And that is the area, when we're thinking about systemic change, that's the area that we're existing in a big chunk of the time, this area of the unknown. And so what we're really trying to do as we're in the unknown is we're trying to mitigate blind spots, remove some facades so we can have even more things in the arena. Next slide. The other thing I want to share with you is this concept of the competing truths. I got it from this podcast I listened to called The Look and Sound of Leadership. And the idea of competing truths, it means that there are these things that are simultaneously true and contradictory. So for example, We are each unique and like no one else. We're like some people and unlike other people. We are each like all other people. Now, all those things are true, and they're also contradictory to each other. And, there are a lot of these contradictions, these competing truths that happen. So, for example, I had a long career as a classical musician, and I love classical music. I devoted my life to being a classical musician, but I also played in concert halls that were segregated during my parents' lifetime. And so I'm playing this music. It doesn't mean that the music was bad, but there was a competing truth for me that I'm playing this beautiful music in these spaces that had been segregated. Next slide. And now I'm going to move to tell you a little bit about my organization, just really fast. When I got to the Community Music Center of Boston in 2017, it was a PWI if ever there were one. PWI means a predominantly white institution. If you look at the numbers here, 21% BIPOC, 20% BIPOC staff, 36% staff leadership, 36% BIPOC staff members, 18% BIPOC faculty. That's the definition of a PWI, and it actually doesn't matter who you work with. A lot of places will say, well, our students make us diverse, and only PWI say that, right? That's the only group that would make a comment like that. And so that is, can we go to the next slide? And then over the course of the last several years, we've moved to now 43% BIPOC board members, 71% BIPOC staff, thank you, 71% and 43% BIPOC faculty. On to the next slide, which is a pretty significant increase over a relatively short period of time. And we were very proud of that. And one of the things that we think a lot about is our hiring practices and how are we recruiting people to be part of our organization, which is a little bit of the conversation we're going to be having today. The folks that we have here on stage, each of them plays a different role in institutional searches, specifically as it relates to the kind of C-suite positions. So you have someone like Weston who has been out. He's got this wonderful job. He's been working with search firms. He's talked to search firms. He's been really a candidate for some very high-profile jobs for sure. And he has this wonderful position right now. You've got Becca Smith here who works for a search firm. So she is an individual who works alongside the candidates and the institutions to try to find the right marriage between them. And then, of course, you have Glenda, who has the same name as my auntie. You have Glenda here, who's a board member, and each one of these folks plays a different role in that process. So my first question is going to be directed kind of to you, Weston, just as someone who has interviewed for positions and has navigated that process. Can you just tell folks a little bit about what the experience has been like for you, kind of from the beginning to now?
It's been interesting and varied. If we're talking primarily about executive searches, one thing that I thought about as we were discussing this a little bit yesterday, we had a kind of a pre-talk was the idea that a lot of people, especially in classical music, as we come up in our training, going to conservatory, things like that, we don't have a real understanding of what executive search culture is all about. I remember the first time I got a call from Russell Reynolds or Isaacson Miller. I was like, who's Russell? I didn't know what was going on, right? That was a new thing, and to have the understanding that if you have a desire to be in senior leadership in a major organization, that's part of a culture you need to be aware of. So that was one part of it, knowing where the places are that are doing these searches, what attracts them to you, who you need to be in contact with to make sure that you end up on their list, on their Rolodex, and understanding what their priorities are. Their priorities are to make sure that they're able to put really great candidates in front of these different organizations, because search firms, they make their money by placing candidates in organizations, right? So if you can actually get into that cycle and do a really good job, it's not that you're just on the radar for one position, you're suddenly potentially on the radar for all of them. And you're also suddenly on the radar to recommend people who you think are really good for all of them. The other thing that I think about is when I first started getting questions about whether or not I would have interest in some of these positions, because of my background as a musician, I have a bachelor's degree in performance. It doesn't scream out as someone who should have an administrative position. But that doesn't mean that a lot of people have had performance careers or performance-based careers and then gone on to do a lot of other things, whether that's teaching or volunteering or starting a nonprofit organization, even if it's not a super high-profile thing, that you don't have the skills to do that. And so the first times that I got called, I thought to myself, why are they calling me? Maybe I should take this interview because it will give me experience 10 years from now when I might be qualified to do something. And then actually, through conversations I had with my friends, you being one of them, you kind of reverse engineer your career to understand all the things that you've done over time that actually qualify you. So I'll pause in a second, but one of the things we talked about yesterday was the idea that oftentimes search firms and organizations will put out a job description and have certain things that are listed as being required, whether that's a master's degree in social work was one that we mentioned yesterday, as opposed to thinking about what are all the skills that someone might gain from getting a master's degree in social work. And so I looked back on my career and thought I spent some time, 7 years on our orchestra committee, and we did a lot of work managing people. We did a lot of work doing negotiations, understanding the budget of a very complex organization like the Metropolitan Opera, starting a nonprofit to help support our musicians. You look back on that and you think, wait a second, I actually have a lot of the skills that would be necessary to do this work. So.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So you have the candidate on one side of the conversation, and then you have a board of directors on the other side. So that's the group that is then coming together to try to find the right candidate for their organization. And Glenda, being a board member and someone who's, of course, been part of many searches, of course, in your role at the Detroit Symphony, but also in your work at the school as well. I'd love to hear, your thinking of what's it like on the other side when you're a board member and you're trying to figure out who we're going to hire. What's that process like? What are some things in there that will be helpful? And maybe what are some potential, to that previous slide, what are some potential blind spots there?
Well, one of the blind spots that I think too many search committees and boards has is thinking that we need someone like those that we have had before. And so what we need to do is to make certain that we are clear about where an organization is going and what kind of leadership it needs to get that organization there. And it may not be what you have had before. But that is really a difficult conversation with board members who have been comfortable with the organization and are not necessarily looking for change. And so one of the things that organizations really has to do is talk about what kind of change they want. Because change is going to happen whether they are prepared for it or not, and obviously it is better to be prepared. So that I would suggest that in any environment, whether or not it is an orchestra, a nonprofit organization, an academic institution, what you need to do is, first of all, think about who you are as an organization, what you need in order to be successful as an organization, what kind of leadership is available or you can find that will indeed be resonant with what you decide you want to be, and then go about the process of searching for that person. And it may not be who you initially thought it would be.
That's beautiful. That vision work is important, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So you've got the candidate and you've got the board, and in between all of that mess, you then have a search firm. You have the consultant. Mm-hmm. And so, Becca, you and I have known each other for several years, and I'd love for you to tell me that then as a consultant working with an organization to help them find that vision and find that next person, can you tell us a little bit about what your process is and what have you some blind spots that are traditional? How have you, in your process, mitigated some of them?
Well, you first start with whoever is hiring, and that can be the it can be the executive, or it can be the search committee. When you're working with a search committee, it's really important to make sure that everybody on that committee understands what the mission of the institution is. And that's not always the case. Sometimes when you ask one person, they have one version of what the mission is. and another person will have a completely different idea of what this organization stands for. So we normally interview each member of a search committee, and we bring them together to really discuss what some of the variations are of what they're thinking about, because unless they are collectively looking for the right kind of person going forward, you're going to have conflict. It's also really important for us as search people to understand the depth of the organization in terms of what's the talent, who's the music director, who on the board brings different talents to the process, and are they on the search committee? Because you really want to make sure you have the right people in the right chairs. So we interview staff, we interview board members, we interview everybody who's on the search committee, and then we go about figuring out how to craft a statement, a position announcement that represents what it is we're really looking for. And we actually try very hard before we even start looking at candidates to make sure that we discuss bias with that committee, because we want to make sure that everybody understands they all come with some bias, but how is that going to affect what they're looking at with the search, within the search context? What are they looking at in terms of candidates? What's the real reason for them to want to have a diverse slate of candidates to look at? And those are some of the key things we start with.
Yeah, there's several things there. Thank you for that. One of the, at the Community Music Center Boston, one of the things that we have in one of our value statements is to minimize the impact of implicit bias. And it's not to, people are going to be biased. So the idea of eradicating that bias is, something to continue to strive for. But what we, but it's a difficult thing. What we can do is we can minimize the impact of that bias on our spaces. Now that is something that's actually very doable and quantifiable. And so I'm just wondering, Weston, something that a lot of organizations are doing right now, and you and I have talked a lot about this, a lot of people are trying to get people of color into the pool. So we got to have, more people of color in the pool. We got to have, we want to make sure we have, 40% of our, candidates should be people of color. And then they end up not hiring any of them, but getting them in the pool. So Weston, you mentioned something a little bit yesterday about, tokenizing the pool and feeling tokenized in pools from time to time. Can you speak to that just a little bit?
Sure. I think, in most of these job descriptions, and some of them are 1 page and some of them are 10 pages, I think organizations really, they want to present themselves in a way that's perhaps even aspirational for them. They want to believe sometimes that they are things that they are not, or that they're ready to be in places that they aren't quite ready to go. And I think it's important for them to be really honest about what that is, because what ends up happening if they're not is that ends up affecting the candidates. And so we got into this conversation about our organization, tokenizing people are actually giving them a serious chance. And in a lot of these job descriptions, there's an area of focus that talks about what's preferred for the job and what's required for the job. And I've been in experiences before, and I know that you have as well, where you go through an entire process, you do, so you're told, incredibly well. And then when you ask, well, why did this not go exactly the way that we thought it was going to go, or why it was not successful? He said, well, because we actually wanted someone who has this particular thing. And he said, well, that was not something that was suggested to be required. You knew that I did not have that thing. You knew that I had not had 15 years of administrative experience 6 months ago before you wasted all of my time to do this. So it's one thing to not be considered for a position because you're just not the correct fit, and that's one thing. But it's another thing to be X'd out of something because they knew that was a clearly disqualifying factor for them from the get-go. And when that happens, that's when you have that feeling of being tokenized. So I think organizations need to be really thoughtful about what they say in their job descriptions and be really honest with themselves about where they're willing to go. One other piece on that is that I think organizations need to be honest with themselves about the fact that they may not even be aware of where they need to go. Oftentimes, to your point about organizations wanting to comfortably stay put or just replace the person that they had before, oftentimes they're basically looking to just put old wine in new bottles. And perhaps if they can find someone with a black face to be exactly the same person they had before, then that could be a win for them. But oftentimes, when you're interviewing a truly different pool of candidates, you're going to get a truly different pool of ideas and visions. And you have to be open to the idea that the vision that we had for our organization or the things that we've done in the past, which got us to where we are, which, by the way, many organizations in classical music are not incredibly satisfied with where they are. So they got to where they are and they're thinking, actually, we're in a struggling position. Perhaps that same thinking, as you were saying, that got you to where you are, is not the thinking that's going to solve the problem. So are we going to be open to someone who is, in our view, perhaps an quote-unquote unorthodox candidate, but realize that that person may bring in something to our organization and change the entire complexity of our team and move us in a direction that we weren't even aware was possible before?
That's a great comment. And actually, I want to go to Becca. Just in your thinking, some of the things we were talking about is organizational culture. And one of the things I say all the time is, I personally feel a way about diversity initiatives in the ways in which they're manifested, because essentially what you do is you have new black and brown people to oppress in your white institution. Right, and that's it. And that's all that kind of happens in programs like that. And so unless the institution is willing and interested in doing some culture work and really setting the tone for the institution, that there's certain types of behavior and certain types of ways of engaging that are no longer tolerated in this new universe that we now live in or we're moving toward, then I think that, until we get to that point, we're going to continue to have like these tokenistic kinds of engagements. And the reason I go to you, Becca, because I have been I was on the board of one of the searches. And one of the things you do is you do a lot of training with the search committee to help them do things like mitigate their implicit bias and thinking about the culture that they're creating. Can you talk a little bit about some of the work that you do there?
Yeah, there are a couple of things to think about. And I found that all of this is much more successful when you're dealing with small to mid-sized organizations. Because once you get into some of the really large organizations, it is really hard because there are centuries of bias that are part of some of those big organizations that prevent them from actually addressing these issues in a very transparent and healthy way. So we have found that over the years, mid-sized organizations, for instance, that have been working hard at looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, who have statements, who have gotten their board involved. It has to come from the top, the board and the executive, because if it's not there, it's not going to happen. There's a lot of harm that can come by just hiring someone and putting them into a mid-management position and expecting them to be the person who gets the organization to change. It's not going to happen. And so there has to be a really solid core of people at the top, on the board level, in the upper ranks, committed to this, who really want to hear diverse voices, who really want and value some of the things that people who have been excluded from these conversations are going to bring into them.
Yeah. And Glenda, I have a question just for you. Thinking about the long experience you have in searches, and you've, of course, having your role, you've been through one, being a candidate as well. I'm curious about what's your perspective on the concept of diversifying the pool, and what that means to you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, diversifying the pool has, in my opinion, too often been what is the title of this session, and that is musical chairs, moving people from one place to another. And for me, diversifying the pool really is all about expanding the pool, expanding the number of people who are prepared for the positions that are out there. It doesn't matter at what level that position exists. If we really want to make certain that our organizations are representative of our community, We have to have enough people in the pool in order to select those who best fit our organization. And we don't talk enough, in my opinion, about how we go about expanding that pool. How do we create a large enough pool of people who are prepared? So what responsibility do we have as an institution to participate in that process of preparation? What responsibility do we have to reach out and to give individuals who don't quite fit the box but have potential? What is our responsibility for taking that minimal risk of putting them into a position where they can grow with the kind of support that we know that they will need? What is it that we, those of us in leadership positions, can do to make certain that we have real choice and that individuals don't find themselves, as was just stated, in a situation where they're put into a pool with lots of folk knowing they're not going to be selected? We should never have that happen, but it happens too often.
Yeah.
That was church. Y'all, that's church. Yeah. No, I'm serious. No, thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for saying that. And you know, I'm going to toss this over to you, Becca. Now, everything that Glenda just said, that's very true. So, as a search firm, how do you guide a board? How do you guide a process? How do you support a candidate? Because I know that you do both. You're supporting the candidates throughout the process as well as the board members. And you know, so how do you manage that?
Well, part of it is making sure that candidates understand who you're actually working for. You're actually working for the institution. And we are really committed to taking care of candidates. We feel that they are, you know, their lives may change, things may happen, there may be extenuating circumstances that an organization is going to have to deal with in order to get this great talent on their team. But before any of that happens, we work with candidates to make sure that they're telling their whole story. There is a myth out there that you need a 1 or 2 page resume. Throw it out. It doesn't exist. You really want to tell your story. You don't know what in your life experience is going to connect you very deeply to members of that search committee. And so we have people rewrite their resumes all the time. We take them through interviews and we say, well, why isn't this on your resume? Or why isn't that on your resume? Because it's important for us to give a complete sense of what these people have potential to bring to your organization. The other thing that's really important is transparency. And that is for us as search consultants to make sure that the candidates understand what some of the problems can be in this process. If they don't have certain skills but are really smart and they've got the personality and drive and vigor to be able to do this, what can the organization do when they're thinking about hiring a person to provide them with whatever professional development may be or extenuating circumstances so that they can work remote and figure out how to make it all work with their family situation? There are so many things that can be on the table during the process of this hiring of this new person.
Yeah, no, thank you. So Weston, something that we talked a little bit about was this concept of gatekeeping and how gatekeeping manifests itself in the search process. You mentioned before, one of the nice things about being on the list is that you can then recommend other people to be on the list, right? So it's like, oh, I'm not interested in that role. Here's a slew of 10 other people who might be interested in that role. So I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about the kind of opportunities on that gatekeeping side, especially in a role like a position like yours, where you are becoming, someone who can recommend folks and, having, a little bit of the Weston stamp can help a little bit. I name drop you all the time, brother. Don't get it twisted. But also maybe some of the blind spots and challenges as it relates to that whole concept of gatekeeping.
Becca's laughing at me because we were just standing backstage, I guess, 30 minutes ago, and she said, "There's this opening for this thing. Do you know anybody?" Let's talk afterwards. Maybe you can give me some names. So yeah, this thing happens all the time. In fact, it's happening right now. You know, what you're talking about, this gatekeeping, is also related to the idea of diversifying the pool. Because one of the reasons oftentimes we don't have very diverse pools is because it's lazier and easier to not. And so I get contacted probably once every couple of weeks about, do you have an interest in this position, or do you know someone else who might be? And one thing I'm very thoughtful about is I always recommend black people. So I'll just say that for sure. I make sure there are always black people on my list of people I'd recommend. Not exclusively black people, but they're always on there. You know, and every once in a while, there are positions where I think it's actually going to take me some time to figure out who would be the right people to recommend for this. And so I then go back to my own networks, whether that's colleagues that I have here at Sphinx, or people like yourself, or people I've worked with at various other organizations. Send mass text messages out to my friends in organizations like Black Orchestral Network and say, hey, look, there's this position open. Who do you know that might be good for this? And that might actually take a couple extra hours of my time, but the end result of that may be that it changes someone's life.
Right.
And that's really, really valuable. And the idea of diversifying your pool and giving people a real opportunity oftentimes comes down to your willingness to invest the time and effort to make sure that your pool is actually diverse, and that you are going to give those people a legitimate opportunity to compete for the position. And that's a conversation that I have with people somewhat regularly, because, you know, sometimes I'm on the side as one of the deans at Juilliard of being the leader of a hiring process for faculty, for example. Yeah. And people very naturally fall into the category of, well, I know this person, that person, and this person was recommended by someone else that was on our faculty, and then you look at the whole group, and people get very precious with their time. And that's something that I've never really understood in these contexts. They say, well, you know, and I'll have this conversation, I'll say, look, if we were to interview these additional 3 candidates who I think are very good, and I don't actually even know them, and you don't either, they could be incredible, and you don't know. How sure are you that they're not qualified? Can you say with absolute certainty, without having met this person, that they're definitely not, it's not possible for them to have the qualifications to do this job? And if the answer to that is no, you're not sure, then why are we not willing to take the extra 2 or 3 hours here to see what's going to happen? You might spend the next 20, 30 years working with this person. That happens in the context of orchestras also. I know we're not talking about the orchestral hiring process, but it's worth mentioning. You think about how many orchestras say, we only have X number of hours to hear these candidates. We can't do 2 days of auditions. You're going to hire the person for 40 years. You can't take 5 more hours? You know, like what's going on? And then people will be upset about what happened. And it's like, you know, well, you know, because people are very precious with the time that's right in front of them. Well, I don't have 2 extra hours. You know, we can't let so-and-so out of rehearsal with a conductor that we don't even like. Things like this, you know, to make a decision that is going to affect the complexity of our organization for decades to come. Yeah. You know, so I'll stop. Yeah.
But you know what? That happens with search committees too.
What's that?
Say more about that.
That happens with search committees too.
Yeah. You know, there's this quote that is attributed to Einstein. You can't solve the problem using the same thinking that created the problem. You know, and I really like that. And another quote is going to go into, this is going to be, I didn't prep them for any of this, so they're on their toes. I love it. We're going to go a little bit of rapid fire. Anyone can answer on this one. Anyone who's read, Ibram Kendi's book, he talks about anti-racism. He said that the heartbeat of racism is denial, and the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. I really like that. I really like that as a concept because it really speaks to naming the problem. We're talking about ending the musical chairs. We're talking about helping our institutions to evolve. We're talking about having the right people who have the right balance of power to be able to evolve an institution. My question for you all is, get ready. In your opinion, what are we really solving for? What's the thing that we're actually solving for when we're thinking about these processes and we're thinking about these institutions? What are we solving for in order for us to end the musical chairs?
We're making a decision about how we can continue to be successful.
Yeah.
We're also finding ways of making our institutions reflect and become more responsible to our communities.
Why don't you just ask the questions you asked yesterday? But if I'm answering the question, I would say it's a decision that we're making as a community of do we actually want to be excellent or not? That's really what it is, because we know that we can't be the best that we can be unless all the voices are in the room. And when we choose to be exclusive, we actively choose to not be our best. So if organizations want to do that, they should just take ownership of the fact that they have basically excluded themselves from the possibility of being the best they can be, and that's a deliberate choice they are making. So when we think about whether or not we want to bring people in, it's like, do we want to be good at this or not? Because if we do, we will be more thoughtful and spend more time and bring in all the voices that we need to make sure we're covering those blind spots that you were talking about earlier.
And provide the resources for those people to be successful. That's really a big part of it.
So I'm gonna ask you one more question. After this next question, I will open it up to the audience for a question. So if you have any questions for us, please feel free to step to the mic and ask your questions. So there is a friend of mine and my consulting partner. Her name was Liza. She had this. She has a consulting firm. She does amazing work. Liza Talusan. I recommend looking her up. But she did some work on hiring with our team, and she put this MIT statistic that came up. It said that homogenous institutions underperformed consistently in comparison to diverse institutions. Like those teams consistently underperformed. Homogenous spaces are just happier. They're happier places to be in. So diverse spaces end up having more challenges and potentially more conflict. And the way that she described it, I love the way she summarized it. She said, the homogenous institutions are happy about losing. And I thought that was such as a beautiful summary of that concept. Right, because again, to those of us who are in the field and as someone who watches a lot of these conversations from the outside, it seems kind of silly that we make this sound like it's chess, but it's really checkers, right? We make it very complex, but again, at the end of the day, there's dope people of color like all over the place. Meet some and hire them. You're not going to find your amazing black candidate at your wonderfully pleasant white church. Like they're just not there. And so being a lot more thoughtful, just institutions just trying to be a lot more thoughtful of the ways in which they're engaging in their hiring process and thinking about their hiring practices. One more rapid fire for you before we move to the questions from the audience. My last question for you is, if you could change this process and this system in one way that you think would make it significantly better, what is the change that you would make in the process? And I'll leave this one open.
I'll jump in and say more board members and more hiring managers who are people of color themselves.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Yeah. Someone else have a thought? Well, you've already changed some things, Becca, so I think you can jump in. There's
there are a lot of things
that you do a lot differently than the system. Okay, I get it. You talked about the personality assessments and things like that. Those are all...
I mean, one of the things that really gets me is that some people, some boards actually insist on putting candidates through an online set of tests, which can be very biased, don't really assess what the person is going to be doing, the skills that they need to do the job. This is one of the things that we actually won't work with an organization that's insisting on that. We do encourage those organizations, though, to consider at the end of the process, when they've got a candidate they really like, to possibly do an assessment, you know, that really talks about how this person is going to perform and possibly need help in certain areas. Everybody wants this to be a successful marriage of the organization and the person. And there has to be a lot of thought that gets put toward that purpose.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that I would do is to bring on to the search committee individuals who are not necessarily fully embedded in the institution. For instance, a subscriber, an individual who enjoys the music, who loves coming to Orchestra Hall, and therefore has a perspective on the institution. Someone who is a teacher in the public schools, who teaches music and wants to help think about how that orchestra can in fact be an orchestra where their students find some affinity. I mean, there are lots of people in the community who have perspective and have interests and have positions that could help to shape the process of bringing in leadership that will address that question. Think beyond who you already know to bring new people into the process.
Yeah, before we, Weston, you alluded to it earlier. And as we're getting ready for the question and answer section, for those of you who might be introverts, there's also Hop In. So please feel free to tap on the Q&A and you can leave your questions there. And we do have someone who is taking views of that to provide answer or provide questions for us. But one of the things that as we were at CMCB was going through this process of really thinking about our hiring practices and the biases that we had. First off, we had to name them and say, hey, there's bias here because if you look at the demographics of of the areas where we are and the demographics of our programs, the probability would say that we'd have more people of color working for us. So if the probability is playing out the opposite, then based on math, some outside force is acting on the probability, right? And so so that is a thing, and so you then got to then manage what the outside force is. I went to this session on thinking about hiring people, and it was a boys and girls club, and they said that one of the lines in their job descriptions was someone must have a master's in social work, and that was something that was considered to be a qualification that was necessary, and they were wondering why they couldn't get more people of color into the pool. Then they went to masters in social work programs and found that a lot of the places they were going, there were predominantly white women who were getting masters in social work. And so they were like, oh, well, if we're making that as the barrier, then we are going to be drawing from a pool that's 80% white women. So then they moved, or a large percentage white women. And that's funny because I was talking to a master's in social work class. I was giving, just a lecture in one of them, and it tracked, But one of the things they said they did was they removed that from the job description. They went and said, well, what are the skills that someone gets in a master's in social work? And we'll list them. So someone who has experience working in disinvested communities, someone who has experience with primary and secondary trauma, someone who has a background and experience working in communities of color. And then once they just listed the things, they were like, they started getting all of these candidates of color because, again, they were actually being able to be better at naming what it is they actually want. I think that's something that Glenda has mentioned as well, and so have others, that being able to name what it is you actually want, and being really honest about that. So I want to see if we have a question here, please.
Yes, hi. I think, Becca, this question is probably going to be mostly for you. And full disclaimer, I have gone through that search process with Becca, and what she says, it's true. She did make me rewrite my resume. But it all worked out, so it was great. But my question is sort of around the responsibility, or what might be the responsibility for a search firm in this process. And I'm curious if this has either come up for you or what your thoughts are around this idea of, you say you do the work with your organizations, but to maybe have to tell an organization who thinks they're ready for a candidate of color to come in, or to hire somebody who's really, however they want to describe it, forward thinking. Maybe they really do think, oh no, we need somebody totally different, to tell them, oh, you're not ready. Like, you are not ready for this candidate that you think you want, or your organization, right? Maybe the committee is, but the organization as a whole isn't. And then the flip side of that, for a candidate who maybe is in the running for those organizations, to say, they actually are not ready for you. And here are the things that you're going to have to face if you take this position.
It's a really good question. And it gets back to organizational culture. How your organization is perceived to the outside world can have a whole lot to do with whether or not we can even interest a person of color in that job. It's sometimes related to geography, and it's sometimes related to how the organization is perceived. If it's perceived as a primarily white organization, and there's no vision, there's no commitment, they're not really making a hard stance on what it means for them, you're really fighting an uphill battle. And the other part of it is that, we often have to be really transparent with candidates and tell them this board or this search committee is not ready for you. We want you to succeed in a position, but this isn't going to be it, because there are deep-seated problems in the organization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Do we have a question from Hopin?
Sure do. This was a popular question on Hopin. How do you go about having uncomfortable conversations with an organization with no HR and only executive leadership?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Oh, you have to be honest. You have to be really, really honest. And it gets back to the question that Alejandra just asked. You have to be able to say to board members, this leadership needs to come from you. You need to do some soul searching. You need to really think, are you ready to make a commitment? Because if you're not, you're setting somebody up to not be successful, for your organization not to be successful. And, as search consultants, we don't want that.
Yeah.
We really don't want to do it over and over again for you. We don't. We want to make sure that if that's where you're at, we will find you a candidate who can fit that role. But don't pretend that you want to see a diverse slate of candidates and not really commit to what all of that means to make that person, to give that person the opportunity to be successful.
I think to that conversation, just a little bit about HR before we go to the question here. The HR question, I hear in many ways where that comes from, and I think that it comes from institutions having a culture of transparency and a culture of trust. And to be honest, the majority of the institutions that many of us work in or have worked in, they don't have that. There is a culture of mistrust. Most people are like, I'm underpaid, I'm looking at the 999s, I'm like, where mine at, right? Like people do feel that a little bit, and so there is this sense of distrust. And I would say that if there was someone who was not in senior management who liked that particular comment, it oftentimes, if you're feeling you're in a space where certain types of conversations aren't welcome, go to another place. Because to be honest, if that institution is not engaging in those conversations, by the time they can muster the energy, you're going to be burned out. And so I would oftentimes tell people that, have the courage to engage and begin the conversation. I was talking to a staff member at CCB last night. She was like, "I got into you, didn't I?" I was like, "Yes, you did. We're good." And she totally did. But again, there has to be this culture of trust inside an institution. And if that culture of trust isn't there, then even an HR staff is, they're going to struggle too, to be honest, because it does then in many ways boil down to culture.
And I think everybody needs to understand what HR is. HR includes payroll, it includes benefits, it includes lots of other things. Sometimes it includes recruiting, but it's really passive recruiting. So if you're responding to an ad that's been put up by HR, you need to ask a lot of questions because chances are they have not put the pedal to the metal about addressing these issues within their organizations.
Did you want to add anything, Glenda?
No, I wanted to say that one of the things that I don't think that we think enough about is mentorship and sponsorship inside of the organization. When you bring new people in who are not of the same old mold, you really need to make certain that they have someone in that institution that is going to mentor them, support them, and provide the kind of shoulder to cry on that so many people who are new and the only one in the institution need. And so I just think that we have to pay more attention to that.
That's a great comment. Question here?
Hi, my name is Steve Wade. I'm president of ROPA. And first of all, I wanted to echo President Price's remark about including someone outside an organization in a committee of importance. I've seen that work very effectively on a couple of occasions. I think it's a good idea. And also, my question, I beg your pardon if it's kind of a dumb question, but are you finding that boards now, post-pandemic, are more risk-averse or less risk-averse?
Yeah. Glenda, I saw you. That sparked a thought. Please.
Well, I think that boards need to be more diverse than they are now, but I also think that we have to look at the question of what does diversity mean? And that's a question that we don't always ask ourselves. And so many times when we talk about diversity, we are talking about bringing individuals of African American descent into the pool.
I think his question was about being risk averse.
Being risk averse, though.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. My bad. No, my bad.
They are.
I heard somebody whisper it over here, so I wanted to say it out loud.
Oh,
my fault.
okay.
No, please.
No, well, maybe let me back up and tell you kind of where I was going with that. We are risk averse because when we bring new people into the pool, we don't always think about what it is that they need in order to make certain that they are successful. And we fear things that, in that risk-averse mode, we fear things that we have not experienced before, that we don't know, and we have to get out of that mode and into the mode of making certain that people are successful and identifying people inside of the institution who are going to be supportive of the individual, supportive of a new way of doing things, supportive of a growth strategy for the institution with respect to its personnel, rather than a hold-on strategy.
Yeah. Becca, I thought I saw a comment. Did you have a thought in Weston maybe as well?
Sure, I'll say whether or not they're more or less risk averse, the fact remains they are risk averse. And which is understandable. If you hear a loud roar behind the bushes, something instinctually is telling you not to go over there and walk away. So we have reasons for why we behave the way that we do. But the issue with a lot of organizations, especially in our field at large, is a lack of recognition that standing pat is a massive risk. It's a real risk. That there's a lot of risk in not being willing to change, and I think everybody fears the unknown, especially for organizations that have not brought in a large percentage of people of color. They're thinking, well, what if people come in and they do things differently than the way that we've done them, or what if they present ideas that I don't understand, or that don't immediately resonate with me, or that perhaps I've never heard that perspective, and I may disagree with it. But the fact may be that something that you disagree with in some ways is exactly what is needed to move the organization forward. And the thinking that you've had for the last 20, 30 years or 100 years for your institution is what has brought it to the place that it is now. So I think there's a place for calculated risk, and across the board. It's interesting, you were talking about institutions that are more small to mid-range are oftentimes the ones that are more willing to make some of these changes. The sad thing is that the bigger organizations and the ones that have larger bankrolls and more financial security are actually the ones that can support this type of risk. Right. They should be able to take on this type of risk more easily. They should be able to look themselves in the mirror and say, you know what, let's take this calculated risk, let's take this chance, and even if something doesn't go quite well, we have the institutional history and knowledge and financial support to allow us to take that risk and to recover from it should it be a mistake, which chances are probably will not be.
Please.
I will say that the institutions who took the time during the pandemic when things were really shut down to take that time to look at themselves and really think about what all of this means are in a better place to take risks than those that just sat there and were afraid. Because now those institutions are looking out at empty seats in their halls and they're terrified as to what to do next. But those that took the time during the pandemic to really think about what kinds of changes we can make to then maximize the opportunities once everybody is well or vaccinated or able to convene again, those are the ones that are really making some progress.
Yeah, that's a great, I'll get to that. Just one other thing, as someone who works with a board, and with my board, when I got there, it took us a long time just to learn about each other. But I told them, actually in my interview, that they were going to have to support some things that they didn't understand. And you're going to have to do that because I am moving inside your privilege often. And so your privilege is going to create blind spots for you. And I'm going to be moving in that space. So you're going to have to actually support some things that you don't understand, because this is a Paul Gorski line. We can either move at the pace of change or at the pace of privilege. And the institutions have to determine at which pace do they want to move. And so now to the question here.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Nugent. I'm president of the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance. We're a philharmonic orchestra, ballet company, and opera all in one package. And full disclosure, I totally owe my job to Becca Smith. But as I've listened to, watched, and read discussions around these topics across a variety of industries, and I hear what's being sought, a seat at the table, a voice, representation. Who cares what I think, but I think that the language about what's being demanded of institutions like ours needs to be much more aggressive, because I can paper the house as a white money-grubbing CEO with representation and seats at the table and make no difference. I think what people of color, LGBT folks, and women need to be asking for and demanding is power, authority, and influence, those three things. And when I watch these articles and people saying, well, all over the place now, folk have been in positions of being a chief diversity officer or whatever for a year, and then they bail. And when they describe what they're lacking, what I hear is that they didn't have the power, they didn't have the authority, and they didn't have the influence to do the job they were asked to do. So for job candidates, I would say, don't be afraid to ask, okay, you're hiring me into whatever this role is, but will I have the power, the authority and the influence to get this job done. Conversely, I think somebody like myself or any senior administrator needs to combat the implicit bias with a little explicit bias and to say, I'm going to do everything I can do to put people of color, LGBT folks, women, into positions of power, authority, and influence. So I'm not just papering the house. I'm putting in place the engines that will, eventually get me the boot, and replace, me with a person like that. So I'd like to hear some ramping up of what's being demanded of our field. That's. Yeah, and that's a trial balloon. I ask you to react to it or shoot it down or whatever, but there it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that. I think that, full disclosure speaking, I'll speak as a black man overall. I know what I need more than anybody, right? And so, as a black man, I would say. Sure, the idea of having more power, but I think it's also moving aside. And to me, that is such an important part of the conversation. Is just it's not only amplifying voices, it's also actually some of these voices are the voices that created the problem. And so sometimes it's nice to, and this is what my board did this, and I was really proud of them. I was like, we're gonna go to things, and I don't want you to say a word. Don't say a damn thing. Just go there and listen, and go there and learn, and take that time to actually to learn. And so I think that in addition to making demands, also the institutions themselves have to be better at learning when to realize that grown folks are talking, and actually being able to step back and sit back at that same table. Did anyone else want to comment on that?
I'll jump on that real quick. I appreciate what you said. I appreciate what you said as well. And I think there's a lot of truth in bringing people into positions of power and agency within organizations. But I would also share, as a black man, that our power does not fully come, even very much come from our position in organization. It's sometimes sometimes there's confusion between power and position. A lot of people have power who don't necessarily have a position, and oftentimes people who don't have a position are far more powerful than the person that is in the position. There's this old saying, it's like the cross had the position and Jesus had the power. Whether you go to church or not, you understand the analogy. Or that LBJ had position, but MLK had a ton of power. So how everyone has an ability to leverage the position that they're in, whether that falls at the top of the org chart or not.
Yeah, no, thank you. Unfortunately, actually, I'm getting the times up brightly on the screen behind me. So unfortunately, this is our time together. But what I want to do is let you all know that this is an ongoing conversation. This is the beginning of the work. I tell people all the time when I do workshops, I'm like, hey, we weren't going to solve racism in 1 hour. It would take 2 hours, and y'all didn't pay me for that, But just being very thoughtful that these are some continued and ongoing conversations. And I encourage everyone here to go back to your institutions and make sure that you are standing up and naming what some of the challenges are, but also being part of solving for them in your institutions as well. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to all of you for coming today. Look forward to seeing you all.